After trading Dejounte Murray to the Atlanta Hawks, Greg Popovich and the San Antonio Spurs find themselves in a position that they haven't been in since an era called the difficult years on their Wikipedia page. It's a rebuild. After a 2-decade run featuring Hall of Famers like David Robinson, Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, and Kawhi Leonard, San Antonio's roster is filled with talented but relatively unproven players. And while they haven't been to the actual playoffs since 2019, this is the first season where it's abundantly clear that San Antonio's priorities have shifted from the present to the future. And while dark days may be ahead for the Spurs, their 2022 draft haul should be an indication of a bright light at the end of the tunnel. So let's get to know these young guys and find out who's spurring the rebuild. Typical of a well-run organization, pretty much all of San Antonio's talent has been drafted by San Antonio. This fits the model of the franchise dating back to David Robinson. And while the Spurs have certainly dipped their toes into the water of free agency, signing guys like Robert Horry, Bruce Bowen, and LaMarcus Aldridge over the years, San Antonio has mainly employed the draft to build their rosters, and the last 4 years are no different. I'd argue that the Spurs have found at least one key foundational piece in each of the 2019, 2020, and 2021 drafts. And that doesn't even include their most recent group, which saw San Antonio select 3 of my personal top 16 players: Jeremy Sochan, Malachi Branham, and Blake Wesley. But before we dive into the key pieces comprising what was my favorite team draft of 2022, let's take a look at some of the already rostered players who seem to be in San Antonio for the foreseeable future. While the Spurs actually had 2 first-round picks in the 2019 draft, only one of them still remains with the team. We can thank a baffling Luka Samanic pick for that one. Kelvin Johnson, though, has made the 2019 draft a prosperous one for the Spurs. At 6'6", 220 pounds, Johnson has now become the focal point of San Antonio's roster. This past season, he averaged 17 points and 6 rebounds a game, while also knocking down 40% of his three-point attempts. While he was utilized as a secondary pick-and-roll handler, his value as an NBA player mainly resides in his shooting and slashing ability off the ball. Johnson was one of the best spot-up three-point shooters in the league last year, especially from the corners where he knocked down 49% of his looks. Good for one of the best marks in the NBA. The key with Johnson is whether or not he can make the leap from high-level complimentary starter to a player worth giving a lucrative extension to after this season. He struggled when tasked with creating offense for himself, and he doesn't have the natural playmaking chops necessary to warrant a high-usage offensive role. Defensively, Johnson is a tweener, and while that bodes well for lineup flexibility, especially with the Spurs team built to play small, it raises questions as to whether or not he can be an impact defender in any given role. Right now, Johnson lacks the lateral coordination and physical strength to be considered a good defender. But still, 22-year-olds shooting nearly 40% from 3 and averaging 17 points a game aren't all that common. So it could be worth furthering his development as the Spurs enter their rebuild. The 2020 draft saw the Spurs take Devin Vassell out of Florida State with the 11th overall pick. While Vassell is only 6'5", his wingspan of 6'10" makes him one of the best young defensive players in the NBA. Going back to his Florida State tape, it was easy to see the appeal of Vassell as a two-way wing in the mold of someone like Mikal Bridges. Vassell's off-ball defensive instincts have translated really well to the NBA, and combined with the ground he can cover on help rotations with his length, Vassell has become a disruptive force capable of guarding multiple positions. Offensively, Vassell seemed pigeonholed into a spot-up shooting wing with limited on-ball upside. And while I'd argue that this is still his most likely outcome, it's worth mentioning that Vassell has improved significantly as a handler to the point where his upside in that area might be worth examining. While the vast majority of his field goals have been assisted, especially from beyond the three-point line, Vassell's real flashes of on-ball scoring and playmaking give hope for a somewhat higher usage offensive player down the line. Regardless of what his outcome is, Vassell is, at worst, a serviceable two-way wing option who is a phenomenal off-ball defender and viable outside shooter. Last year, the Spurs kinda surprised people by taking Joshua Primo at 12. He wasn't utilized like a traditional lottery pick during his lone year at Alabama, but still the 6'6" guard had enough momentum behind him due to his youth and on-ball flashes to push him into the lottery. Before being taken by the Spurs, Primo was seen as a pre-draft candidate, meaning that he would be drafted in the first round a year before he was truly ready to play in the NBA, but also before he would go back to school for a second year and rise up draft boards, making it more difficult for the Spurs to get him. And while the Spurs got their guy, the problem with getting Primo so early was that it pretty much threw out the value component of drafting Primo in the first place, as they drafted him in the 2021 lottery as opposed to the 2022 lottery where most people would have had him going. Despite being taken in the lottery, Primo did start playing in the G League, but as roster moves were made throughout the season, he ended up playing 50 games in the NBA this year, with his numbers being pretty pedestrian. Still, he's only 19 and he has shown reasons to believe in his growth as a playmaker. While these three players all have skill sets worth valuing, it's still a concern as to who can step up and be the face of the rebuild. Among Johnson, Vassell, and Primo, over 90% of their three-point makes were assisted, suggesting that self-creation isn't their collective strong suit. The Spurs need someone to take a next step as a creator and generate offense on his own. But help could be on the way, because they drafted two guys this year that project as offense generators in different ways: Malachi Branham and Blake Wesley. Branham starred during his lone year at Ohio State, averaging around 13 points a game on near 50-40-80 shooting splits. While he didn't show a lot as a playmaker for the Buckeyes, I still saw Malachi as a top 5 guy in this year's draft class because of his shot creation ability. While he was mainly a spot-up three-point shooter at Ohio State, which at first glance wouldn't really interest a Spurs fan looking for on-ball creation, a deeper look at Branham's shooting splits indicates a highly efficient isolation scorer. Branham shot 43% on two-point attempts away from the rim, an impressive number on its own, but what's even more fascinating is that only 18% of his makes were assisted. And before you question sample size, it should be noted that non-rim two-pointers made up the most substantial portion of Malachi's shot diet. This indicates a legitimate self-creation gene that the current Spurs are perhaps lacking. Branham also shot over 70% at the rim while being assisted on 21% of those makes. For reference, all of these numbers are comparable, if not better, than Devin Booker's lone year at Kentucky. While he has ways to go to be a viable defender, his plus wingspan gives him enough positional size to at least hang on the defensive end. Although I never see it being the greatest strength of his game. Branham can also stand to improve as a playmaker for others. He isn't selfish, but he does miss potential passing reads that he needs to make to become a franchise-altering player. Part of this is due to a lack of confidence in his ball handling, even though he shows really nice flashes of advanced dribble maneuvers at times. Overall, Branham plays with the pace and poise of a go-to scorer, but time will tell if the necessary skills develop along with it. On the other end of the creation spectrum is Notre Dame's Blake Wesley. Taken 6 picks after Branham, Wesley is another unexpected one-and-done who impressed NBA decision-makers with his athleticism and burst. Seen as a Jaden Ivey-esque sophomore leap candidate, Wesley decided to forego an opportunity to rise up draft boards in 2023 and test his luck in this year's draft. And it worked out for him as he was a first-round pick. The definition of Wesley's game on offense is advantage creation. Wesley's ability to get into the paint is remarkable. He can blow by defenders with speed and power, which makes him appealing in the NBA, where he'll have even more space to operate. While Wesley excels at creating space and getting downhill on his own, the rest of his offensive game needs more polish, hence why he fell to 26th. While he has an advanced handle, Wesley struggles with decision-making and finishing, 2 musts for an NBA-level advantage creator. Wesley converted only half of his 198 shot attempts in the paint this year, and his struggles finishing at the rim really came to a head in the NCAA tournament, where he had a difficult time finishing through length and physicality. In addition to his finishing issues, Wesley's decision-making was also suboptimal, and while he did have some impressive reads and passes, he often fell victim to his own over-dribbling. Despite these issues though, Blake still possesses a high potential for advantage creation because of his first step and handle. His ability to go from a standstill and immediately shift to defense can unlock a lot of things in NBA space, so it's a matter of whether or not he can improve as a finisher and a processor. I see Branham and Wesley as high-level NBA players, yet neither of them were taken before fellow Spurs draftee Jeremy Sochan. Finding a 1-through-5 defender in the NBA is like finding Bigfoot. A lot of people say they've seen it, but its very existence is always up for debate. Using this flawed analogy, Jeremy Sochan is proof that Bigfoot is real. Sochan's immediate calling card will be his defense. At 6'9", 230 pounds, he moves his feet extremely well, has the length to contest shots, and the strength to hang on the block, as he spent his lone season at Baylor containing every type of player imaginable. Not only is he incredibly versatile, but he's also incredibly active. Deflections, blocks, steals, Sochan's great at getting all of those. He just makes things happen on the defensive end. While he sometimes gambles off the ball, his presence is usually enough to make life hell for opposing offenses. Offensively though, Sochan is less polished. It's clear he thinks the game well, as he makes solid passes and has good timing on cuts, but he can also get baited into making bad decisions and turning the ball over. Generally, I do think he has good ball skills as a dribbler for his size, but his offensive value is going to come down to his shooting making a jump. He only knocked down 29.6% of his threes at Baylor, and that number needs to improve to get the most out of his upside. I am a believer that Sochan will shoot despite his struggles from 3 and the free throw line. He has good touch in mid-range settings, and his form is compact and replicable in the speed of an NBA game. With his defense, intelligence, and motor though, Sochan projects as a key piece of the rebuild no matter how his shot ends up. The Spurs don't project to be a very good team this year, but with their previous draft acquisitions and the strength of their most recent class, they certainly have a promising future. And remember, the good thing about being bad is that it gives you another chance in the lottery. And who knows, maybe they'll be bad enough this year to land a generational prospect like Victor Wembanyama. But even if they don't get their hands on a guy like him, there are still plenty of pieces worthy of excitement in San Antonio. Thanks for watching, and give me your thoughts below.